All right, how's everybody doing today? Today's topic, the Nikkor 50mm f2 versus the Nikkor 50mm f1.8. Are they really all that different? Are they really all that similar? Is there reason to prefer one over the other if you can only have one? Short answer, no, there's not. And now for the long answer. So I'm going to go through the history and characteristics of these two lenses, basically. The information that I'm going to relate to you comes overwhelmingly from the 1001 Nights lens blog or lens optical engineers blog on the Nikon's website. I will link down below to the two relevant entries. There is an entry dedicated to the 50mm f2 AI version, which is what this is. There is another entry dedicated to the 50mm f1.8 Pancake Japan market only version. This is a long nose. It's a different version. I'm going to go over the different versions of the 1.8 in this video. Anyway, there are two entries in the 1001 Nights. I'll link to them down below. That's where I'm getting the lion's share of my information. Okay, so let's start off. Let's get started. So the 50mm f2 began life as the Nikkor H. Sorry about that. Began life as the Nikkor H 50mm f2, introduced in January of 1964. That was a pre-AI lens with the scalloped metal focusing rings with a optical formula of 6 elements in 4 groups. It was updated to the Nikkor HC in December of 1972, the C indicating multi-layer coating, otherwise optically the same. The K series was introduced in November of 1974. The K series, if you recall, refers to those Nikkor lenses, the pre-AI Nikkors with rubber focusing rings manufactured between 1974 and 1977. There was an optical difference introduced in the K series. The closest focusing distance was reduced to 45 centimeters from 60 centimeters. So if you have a 50mm f2 with scalloped metal focusing rings, then its close focusing distance is 0.6 meter, whereas the ones with the rubber focusing rings, like this, have a closest focusing distance of, there you go, there you see it, 0.45. Okay. The AI series, which is what this is, was introduced in March of 1977. There were no optical changes. In fact, as far as I can tell, there are no real changes at all. In order to differentiate an AI converted K series from an AI series, I think you need to run down the serial numbers. And based upon the serial number on this lens, from what I can tell, this is a fairly late production lens. I think this was from the very last version of the 50mm f2s, which were made. And the AI series was discontinued it was introduced in March of 1977 and then discontinued in January of 1979. Again, no optical changes to the K series. All versions of the 50mm f2 have 6 aperture blades. That is unusual in Nikkor land. The vast majority of Nikkor lenses were upgraded to, or they added a 7th blade at some point in the 1960s. Most Nikkors, the classic Nikkors of the early 60s, originally had 6 blades. A few had 9, most had 6. But then most of those were upgraded by the end of that decade to 7. But the f2 never was. The 50 f2 just kept 6 aperture blades throughout its production run. Okay. 50mm f1.8. This is a little bit more of a complicated story. The long nose version, which is this, and they call it the long nose because it's not a pancake, basically. So if you compare the size, here's a 1.8, here's the f2. They're roughly the same size. Even the so-called long nose is a little bit more compact, a little bit shorter than the f2, but not by much. I don't know, maybe a millimeter? I don't know. I should have looked that up before I did the video. But it is called the long nose simply because it's not a pancake. There was the pancake version is like 2 or 3 millimeters shorter. It's not that much shorter. Anyway, so the long nose was released in 1978. That was the very first version of the 50mm f1.8. The Series E Pancake was released in 1979, and then the Nikkor Ais Pancake was released in 1980, although there were two versions of this that I'm going to talk about. And I'll go over the differences in a minute. It's a little bit complicated. So, again, the text in quotation marks here is taken directly from the 1001 Nights blog written by Nikon's optical engineers. The AIS Nikkor Pancake was a further improvement on the long nose. How much improved? I don't know. Improved in what way? Doesn't say. This is the only statement I can find on anywhere on the 1001 Nights which comments on the relationship between the pancake and the long nose. But apparently the AIS Nikkor Pancake, at least this version here, the one that was introduced in 1980, was a further improvement on the long nose. Whether the Series E was, that's up for grabs. I'll talk about that in a minute. So the AIS Nikkor Pancake and Series E were actually sister lenses designed with the same basic optics, but different outward appearance and coatings. That's a direct quote from Nikon. Well, I don't think I need to explain that. It says what it says. Again, quote, the same basic optical design was reborn as the AF Nikkor 50mm f1.8. Its rendering characteristics remain the same. So as far as I can tell, the pancakes optically, if they're not identical, they are virtually identical. That is the Series E, the AIS Pancake manual focus, and the AF Nikkor, which eventually became the AFD Nikkor, and I think it's still in production. I think you can still buy those things new. Share the same optical formula, and it is a very successful optical formula. 6 elements in 5 groups, 7 aperture blades, all versions. Long nose, pancake, autofocus. 6 elements, 5 groups, 7 aperture blades. All right, here's the fun part. So this I got from the photosynthesis website. I forgot the gentleman's name in New Zealand who runs the photosynthesis website, which lays out in detail the specs of all the classic Nikkor lenses, and God bless him for doing so. So the long nose AI, which is this, the long nose AI. Here's a long nose, and we know it's an AI because the smallest aperture number on the ADR scale is white. If it were an AIS, this would be orange. So we know this is an AI series lens. This was manufactured from January 1978 to October 1982. There was also a long nose AIS, which I also own. I have 2 long noses. And this is the 50mm f1.8. It is the AIS because you can see that smallest aperture number on the ADR scale is orange, indicating an AIS series lens. And apparently the aperture ring on this version is slightly narrower than the aperture ring on this version. So there was a notation on the website that indicated that, and that may be true. It looks like the prong here sort of covers up these numbers a little bit, whereas on here we don't have that issue. So yeah, maybe that's so. All right. So long nose AIS in production July 81 to September 1985. So that's a nice long production run for the long nose. The long nose essentially was produced from 78 to 85. Series E Pancake. The Series E Pancake lens, there were 2. Cosmetically, there were 2 versions, but mechanically and optically they were identical, so I'm not differentiating here. Series E Pancake was manufactured from March 1979 to at some point in 1985. The photosynthesis website does not give a month, so from March 79 to 1985. Here's the big deal on the Series E. Closest focusing distance of 0.6 meters. All right. On all other versions, or at least on the long nose version, the closest focusing distance is 45 centimeters. Okay. 1.8, closest focusing, 45 centimeters. The Series E Pancake, closest focusing distance, 0.6. The AIS Pancake Nikkor Japan market only, produced from 1980 to 1982, had a closest focusing distance of 0.45. same as the long nose. Then in 1985, we have an Ais Pancake Nikkor, which is the photosynthesis site simply calls it new, but I assume this is export market. I don't know, I don't know if it was sold in Japan or not. Anyway, regardless, the Japan market only version was discontinued in 1982. 3 years later, there's an Ais Pancake Nikkor, introduced in 1985, and which runs, the production run continues to 2005, closest focusing distance 0.6 meters. So, of all the Pancake lenses, it appears that the Japan market only version, AIS version, manufactured from 1980 to 1982, that's the one to have. If you're a collector and you want the best of the best, and that's your goal, that's what you're out for, and you had heard that the Pancake was a really, really awesome lens, well, you heard right. If you want a manual focus version of those optics, then the version to get is the Ais Pancake Nikkor, Japan market only, which you can identify by its closest focusing distance of 0.45 meters. However, bear in mind that the autofocus version of this optical formula also focuses down to 45 centimeters. So if you're collecting for practical purposes, because you want to be able to focus close, the easiest way to do that is to get the autofocus version, or the AF or AFD version, which has the same optical formula. It's going to have coatings which are just as good, if not better, than the 1980s version, and it will focus down to 45 centimeters. This is kind of, sort of for collector interest only, really. In terms of practical value, practical optical value, or mechanical capabilities, the autofocus lens is just as good. All right. So, here's a fun question. Why was the f1.8 lens developed? Was there anything wrong with the f2? What do you think the answer to that is? You know the answer to that. The answer is no, there's nothing wrong with the f2. Here's why. These are direct quotes from the 1001 Nights blog. Development of the Nikon Series E began with the goal of producing a line of lenses suited to the compact size and lightweight of the EM. That is the Nikon EM, the budget SLR introduced in '79, I believe, and which lacked any provision for manual control of shutter speeds, and therefore I don't take it seriously, but I digress. There were 3 issues, and I think when they say 3 issues, I think he means 3 requirements. With the Ais Nikkor 50mm f1.8. It had to be compact, inexpensive, and offer excellent performance. So these were the 3 design parameters, the 3 goals that the engineers were given. As far as compact and inexpensive goes, the 50mm f2 produced since the Nikkor Auto, that is the pre-AI days, comes to mind. But a maximum aperture of f1.8 had become the norm with 50mm lenses at the time. By the late 1970s, all the other manufacturers, that is Minolta, Pentax, Olympus, Yashica, all the other major manufacturers of the period, I think Yashica, Fujinon, I don't know, but certainly Canon, Minolta, Pentax, Olympus, their quote-unquote budget or low-end 50mm lenses had maximum apertures of either f1.7 or f1.8, and they closed down to f22. The Nikkor 50mm f2 was an old-school lens, which is why some of us love it, but it has a restricted by later standards, aperture range of f2 to f16. The f1, the new lens, the replacement, that's the AIS. It's a little dirty. This one's cleaner. So the f1.8 goes from 1.8 and it closes down to f22, which is more consistent with the competition of the period. I know that the Canon lens, the Canon Budget 50 back then also had a range from 1.8 to 22. I believe Minolta had a 1.7 lens that closed down to 22. I believe Pentax had a 1.7 lens that closed down. I think the Pentax closed down to 22. Anyway, but that was the trend at the time. So it was a marketing issue. It had nothing to do with the optical quality of this lens. Nothing. I mean, it's the norm of 50 millimeter lenses at the time. Therefore, f1.8 had become the norm at that time. Therefore, changing the exterior of an f2 lens with no competitive strength was not an option. And by competitive strength, he simply means the feature set, the features of, the marketable features of the lens. So the decision to develop the f1.8 in the first place had nothing to do with the optical quality or mechanical fitness of this lens at all. That was simply not a consideration. Rather, it was a marketing decision. It was purely a marketing decision which led to this lens being replaced by the f1.8. Okay. So here are a few remarks again, and I will link down below to the 1001 Nights entries on both of these lenses, which go into excruciating detail describing the rendering and optical characteristics. And I don't mean to mock that. I mean, these are well-written descriptions by the men who designed these lenses and who took this stuff very seriously. And if you're really into it, by all means, follow the links down below and read the entire entries. I'm just going to hit the highlights here. Of the 50 millimeter f2 AI series, and I quote, "Thus, with few faults, this lens can stand comparison with the latest designs for its impressive performance. If we must give it a drawback, it might be the very slight barrel distortion." So apparently this lens does suffer from very slight barrel distortion, although in order to detect that, you need to do some pretty serious pixel peeping. You need to photograph a grid-shaped design or object, or perhaps if I really wanted to measure that, I could. I live near the beach, so I could, like, if you photograph, say, the horizon line above of a large body of water, that'll give you a pretty darn straight line. And you can measure lens distortion that way, but I'm not going to bother. For me, it's a pixel peeping issue, unless you do forensic work requiring absolute straight lines at intense magnification. Then this slight barrel distortion is a non-issue. Of the Nikkor Ais Pancake, the Nikon engineer writes, "Almost zero geometrical distortion." That's its claim to fame. That's what everybody knows the Pancake for. When people rave about the Pancake and say, "Oh, it's one of the best," it's one of the best. Well, it is on this with respect to this quality. It has virtually no distortion. That's the Pancake's big claim to fame. But again, I take the position that the difference in geometrical distortion between the Pancake and the f2 can only be detected at high magnification. That is to say, pixel peeping, which for your typical hobbyist is just, well, that's between you and your therapist, in my opinion. Okay, so Angry Photographer Awards. If you are a fan of Ken Wheeler, the Angry Photographer, back in the good old days, he used to make videos about lenses, or about the lenses that we like to collect, the classic manual focus Nikkor lenses. And in December 2017, Ken published to his Flickr account, which is Anankephi, Anankephi, a list of the best micro-contrast Nikon lenses. And he named the 50mm f1.8 AFD, that is the autofocus, the screwdriver autofocus, which shares the same optical formula as the Pancake, is listed as among the, quote, very best current production. The 50mm f2 AI, Ken lists as among the no longer in production very best. So, again, if you're an angry photographer fan, perhaps that has some meaning for you. Okay. Wrapping up. The commonalities between these two lenses. They both offer superior sharpness and contrast. Both lenses, again, I'm drawing from the text in the 1001 Nights blog. The optical flaws of both lenses are well controlled by f4. That is, you open them up wide open, wider than f4. That is, you're going to see some distortions, a bit of flare, vignetting, spherical aberration, coma, so forth. Optical flaws. And also, both lenses are subject to double-line bokeh under some conditions. And this is probably the major thing which differentiates the f2 and f1.8 from the f1.4. I'm pretty sure that the f1.4 was designed, one of their goals was to eliminate the possibility of this. So there is a potential bokeh issue with the f2 and f1.8, though in my experience, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen very often, and at least not the way I shoot. Here are a couple of quotes which I'd like to end the video with. Of the 50mm f2, quote, "This lens exhibits a large change in imaging characteristics, from a distinctive, fine and delicate image when fully open to a crisp, high contrast when stopped down." Of the Ais Pancake, differences in rendering characteristics that occur in accordance with the aperture setting make this a lens which can be enjoyed for its uniqueness. And I really think that says it all. This is why we collect. I mean, this is why we collect classic lenses. They're not only optically superior or optically great, or as good as the stuff that's produced nowadays. I mean, it's as good as the stuff that's produced nowadays if you stop it down a little bit. Wide open, yeah. But a few clicks in, again, by f4, certainly by f5.6, these lenses are as sharp and contrasty as anything made today. Whereas you open them up a little bit, and you're going to get some character. This lens has a look at f2. And f2.8. And by f4, that look is well controlled, and by f5.6 and f8, it's pretty, sterile, you might say. I mean, just sharp, contrasting. Open it up, it has a different personality. That's why we love them. That's why we collect them. It's not a bug, it's a feature. That is why we love these lenses, because they have personality. They are not sterile. They are not. They're not dry and ordinary and plain and uniform. They do have different rendering characteristics at different apertures and at different focusing distances, and we love them for it. And that's why they're so awesome. And that's why those of us who collect them really believe in them and believe that they are better in that regard overall than the stuff that's being produced today, which is overcorrected and just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. All right, and I will end on that note. I hope you found this video useful, informative, amusing, or at least not a total waste of your time. And if so, please do like and subscribe. And as always, check out the links down below. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.